The snow came sideways off the ridge that night. It did not fall so much as Hunt. I had already been walking for 4 hours in boots that had stopped being waterproof sometime around October. It was Thursday, November 14th. I knew that because I counted days the way a person counts them when he has nowhere to go. That count was the only thing that made the hours feel real. It had been 41 days since I left Harlan, Kentucky. 41 days since I packed everything I owned into a canvas army surplus duffel bag, walked to the end of Crawford Street, and turned north on a 2-lane road toward Daniel Boone National Forest. I never fully understood why north seemed more honest than any other direction. I was 18 years old, weighed maybe 150 pounds with a backpack included, and carried $63, a buck 110 folding knife I had kept on me since I was 14, half a box of salted crackers, and that particular kind of stubbornness that gets young men killed in the mountains every winter. The ridge I was crossing rose somewhere above 4,000 feet on the eastern edge of Owsley County, Kentucky. It was a fold of the Cumberland Mountains that did not appear on any driver's route because nobody went there without a serious reason. The locals called the place Panther Knob, though I had never seen that name on any map. Painter was an old Appalachian word for panther. It came from the big cats people believed once roamed those hollows before the timber companies cut down everything worth cutting. Whatever those animals had hunted there was long gone. What remained was second-growth oak and poplar, thick laurel, and a wind that felt personal. I had dropped below the tree line when my left foot broke through the ice over a creek crossing I had not seen in the dark. The water hit my leg like a clenched fist. Cold like that is not a temperature. It is a decision the mountain makes about you. I said something out loud that I will not repeat. Then I dragged myself onto the opposite bank and stood there in the darkness, listening to my own breathing, trying to calculate how much time I had before the cold climbed my leg and began making decisions about the rest of me. That was when I saw it. About 40 yards up the hollow, half hidden in the shadow of a hemlock, there was a shape that did not belong to the forest. A straight line. Was meeting at right angles. Human geometry in the middle of something that seemed determined to forget people had ever existed. I stood still for a long moment. The wind cut through me. My left leg was moving from pain into that quieter, more dangerous condition where you can almost feel nothing at all. Then I started toward it because the mountain had just offered me something. And whatever else I had learned in 18 years, I had learned this: when a mountain offers you something in the dark, you do not stop to ask questions. The cabin was smaller than it had looked from across the hollow, at about 13 feet by 15 feet. I would learn that later, measuring it by steps after my hands started working again. The walls were made of hewn logs, notched and fitted at the corners without nails, the way people built when nails cost money and time did not. The roof had a hard pitch. Even in the dark, I could make out sheets of tin, though one section along the eastern eave had lifted like a lid and was letting in the sky. The door was made of planks, 2-inch hemlock boards hanging from iron hinges. There was no lock. Only a wooden latch on the outside, the kind you lift with a finger. I stood in front of it for a moment with one boot soaked, one leg refusing to obey, and the wind pushing against my back from the hollow. I thought about what might live inside something that had not been opened in God knew how long. A bear den. Wasps. Rot eaten all the way through the floor, ready to drop me the second I stepped inside. Then my leg stopped feeling the cold completely, and I lifted the latch. The smell that came out was not decay. It was old wood and wood smoke, so deeply worked into the fibers that it had become part of them. There was something faintly animal too, probably mouse nest somewhere. Beneath all of it was something almost sweet, like dried herbs, sawdust, or cedar. The smell of a place where someone had lived carefully, then left with a kind of care. I took the flashlight from my jacket pocket, a Streamlight Protac I had carried for 2 years, one of the few things I had been smart enough to bring. The beam moved across the interior, and I stood in the doorway taking inventory the way a man in trouble takes inventory, floor first, then ceiling, then the most important corners. The floor was intact. Rough boards, grey with age, but solid when I shifted my weight onto the threshold. The ceiling, the underside of the rafters, was so low I would have to watch my head. And in the far left corner, the most important corner of all, stood a stove. It was a small barrel stove, a cast iron, set on a square of firebrick. The pipe went straight up and passed through a tin collar in the ceiling. I crossed the room in 3 steps, crouched down, opened the firebox door, and shone the flashlight inside. Clean. Someone had cleaned it before leaving. There was no ash. Only the faint ghost of rust on the iron and a small curl of birch bark lying on the grate, as if it had been placed there on purpose, like a note. I sat down on the floor with my back against the cold side of the stove and began pulling off my boot because the first problem was my foot. There would be time later for every other question. The boot came off hard. My toes had gone wooden from the cold, and the laces were frozen on the hooks. I worked them loose one by one, slowly, as if I were disarming something. When the boot finally gave way, I set it beside me, pulled off the wool sock, and simply looked at my foot for a moment without touching it. The 2 smallest toes on my left foot were the color of a bruised plum. Not white. I knew white was worse. They were dark purple at the tips, shading through red into something almost normal near the arch. I pressed the tip of one finger against the little toe. There was feeling there, a dull, a distant, like pressing through a leather glove, but it was there. I breathed out through my nose, wrapped both hands around the foot, and pressed it against the inside of my thigh. I sat like that, leaning against the cold iron of the barrel stove, while sensation returned in slow waves, equal parts relief and suffering. Outside, the wind strengthened. I could hear it finding the gaps in the cabin, a thin whistle near the north-facing window, a low moan somewhere in the eve above me. The flashlight rested against my knee, throwing a circle of yellow light onto the nearest wall. That was when I truly looked at that wall for the first time. Above the single window was a shelf. On it were 2 cans with labels too faded to read in that light. Beside them sat a tin cup with the handle broken off, the break old and clean. And against the wall below the shelf was something I had not noticed in those first cold minutes after arriving, a splitting maul with a replaced handle, the head wrapped in copper wire to keep the steel from sliding down the wood. Someone had cared for that maul. Someone had cared enough to wrap it with wire and set it back in the corner where it could be found. I pressed harder on my toes. The pain sharpened, which was good. Sharp pain means living tissue. My thoughts kept returning to the curl of birch bark on the stove grate. It was too deliberate. Whoever had cleaned that stove had cleaned it down to bare iron and then left exactly one thing inside. Not by accident. You do not place birch bark on a grate by accident. You place it there because birch bark catches from one match even if it has been dry for 10 years. You place it there because you expect someone to come after you in the cold, and you want that person to have fire within 60 seconds of deciding fire is needed. Someone had thought of me. Not me specifically, but whoever I might be. Whoever came next. I looked at my backpack by the door, with a small bundle of resinous splinters tied to the outside frame. Then I looked back at the maul. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, boots off, wool socks twisted, working my toes one by one with my thumbs. I let the weight of what I was seeing settle over me the way cold air settles into a hollow. The maul. The back. The swept floor. The wire-wrapped handle. This was not a cabin someone had abandoned in panic. This was a cabin someone had closed. There is a difference. And once you have seen both, you never confuse them again. To abandon something means leaving behind what you planned to come back for. To close something means doing everything that needs doing before walking out for the last time. And doing it with the next person in mind. My toes were starting to burn, which meant the blood was moving. I pulled the socks back on, stood up, and went to the stove without touching the back. I needed to understand the room before changing anything in it. The interior walls were rough-sawn pine boards, the kind that come from a mill with no interest in perfection. The gaps between the boards were chinked with something that looked like dried moss mixed with clay, and in most places the chinking still held. One section near the northwest corner had crumbled, and the gap there was wide enough to slide 2 fingers through. That was where the wind came from. I pushed my fingers into it. The air moved over my skin like water. That was the first repair. Not the roof. I had checked the roof when I came in, and it was holding. Not the door. The door hung straight, and the latch seated cleanly. The first repair was the gap in the northwest corner. I had to fix it before dark because the temperature kept falling and I could already feel it through the floorboards, cold radiating up from the ground below. I went to my backpack. I had a small roll of fiberglass insulation stuffed into a trash bag, about 2 pounds of it. More habit than planning. My grandfather had once told me, always carry something you can use to plug a hole. I had already used it once on a broken truck window. Now I tore off a piece with my hands and pressed it into the gap, then another behind it, until the wind stopped. The room changed instantly. Not warm. It was a long way from warm. But quiet. A room that does not leak air will hold whatever heat you put into it. A room that leaks will hold nothing. I turned back to the stove. The batch back lay on the grate exactly as the person who placed it there had left it. I crouched before the open door and looked at it for another moment. Then I reached into the breast pocket of my shirt and took out a box of matches. I had a large lighter too, but first came the matches. And I thought about the person who had swept that floor. The match struck on the first try. I touched it to the edge of the batch back and watched the flame find the oil in the paper-thin outer layer. As it always does, there was a brief hesitation, then a decision. The bark curled and caught. Beneath it, whoever had laid that fire had placed cedar shavings on a bed of dry grass. Beneath that were 2 split pieces of softwood, no thicker than a wrist. Beneath those was 1 piece of hardwood, dense and dark, probably oak, split clean and seasoned to the color of old leather. It was a teaching fire. Someone had built it the way you build a fire when you want the person who finds it to understand something. I sat back on my heels and watched it grow. The stovepipe ticked as it expanded with the heat. The first smell came from old dust burning, creosote on the pipe walls, something faintly animal, maybe mouse nest disturbed somewhere in the chimney. Then that passed. What remained was simple wood smoke, clean and particular. Wood smoke from trees that had grown in cold ground. I know that sounds like something a man says to sound poetic. I mean exactly what I am saying. Smoke is not all the same. By the time the hardwood caught, maybe 8 minutes after I struck the match, I could feel radiant heat on my hands from 3 feet away. The single window pane to my left was already beginning to fog at the corners. The room measured about 11 by 15 feet with a low ceiling. The walls were bare logs, chinked between the gaps. A shelf ran along the north wall, fixed directly to the logs with hand-forged iron brackets, not cast ones. You could see it in the slight unevenness of the bends. On the shelf were 3 glass jars with lids, their contents impossible to make out in the dim light. There was a tin coffee can, a folded piece of cloth, and at the far left end of the shelf, leaning against the log wall at a slight angle, a notebook. Not a spiral notebook. Not a school notebook. Something older, the hardbound ledger, about 6 inches by 9 inches. The cover was a dark green-brown color that might once have been black. The spine was cracked. A strip of leather had been wrapped around it twice and tied with a half hitch to keep it closed. I did not go to it right away. There is one thing cold does to your judgment after you have been outside long enough. It makes you impatient. It makes you grab, open, and use. I had learned to wait that impulse out. First, I needed to feed the fire, check the door, take off my wet gloves, and hang them somewhere they could dry. I pulled the only wooden chair to within 1.5 feet of the stove and sat down. The stove ticked as it expanded. I pulled off the left glove first. The wool had frozen slightly at the cuff, and the fabric came away stiff, leaving a faint cloud of frost. Then I removed the right one. My fingers were the color of raw meat, and the feeling returning to them was that particular burn that is not yet warmth, just the body arguing with itself. I draped both gloves over the back of the chair, close enough to the stove to dry, but not close enough to scorch. I had learned that difference the hard way in November. A glove with a burned palm is worse than a wet one. The fire was drawing well now. I could hear it. Not the crackling sound fires make in movies, but a low, steady pull, almost like breathing. The stovepipe seemed tight, and the damper was set properly. Whoever built that chimney knew what he was doing. You can recognize a careful person by his chimney the same way you can recognize him by his stitching. I sat with my palms open to the heat and let my eyes adjust to the room. The space was small, maybe 13 by 16 feet, which I would later measure properly with a knotted cord I kept in my backpack for that purpose. The walls were hewn logs, the gaps filled with what looked like clay and dried moss. Here and there in the upper corners, the chinking had fallen out, which explained the draft I had felt near the door. The floor was made of split logs, flat side up, worn smooth along the path between the stove, the door, and the shelf. Floors were that way only after decades of the same feet walking the same line. On the south wall was the only window, about 1 foot by 18 inches, covered with what had once been oilcloth. It had become brittle and translucent, letting in a great, indifferent light that did nothing for the visual warmth of the room. Against the east wall was a single cot with a rope webbing. The rope sagged, but had not broken. On it lay a thin, stiff mattress stuffed with something that had compressed to 2 inches. On top was a folded blanket, a dark grey wool, moth-eaten along one edge. Someone had lived here. Not visited. Lived. There is a difference you can feel in a room before you understand it. Places where people only pass through have a certain passive emptiness. Places where people have lived resist. This place resisted. My eyes kept returning to the notebook on the shelf. To the leather strip tied around it with a half hitch. That was the knot a person uses when he expects to untie it himself. Not a knot meant to seal something forever. That meant something. Or I was convincing myself that it meant something. I rose from the chair, crossed the 3 steps to the shelf, and lifted the notebook carefully with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. The leather felt dry under my fingers, almost chalky in the cold. I untied the half hitch slowly, the way I would if the knot mattered. And it did, though I could not yet explain why. The strip came free, and I laid it on the shelf beside me. The cover was dark brown, or had been once. Decades of handling had worn it lighter along the spine and the corners, leaving a ghostly outline where a hand had gripped it most often. I opened to the first page. The handwriting was small and vertical, written in pencil kept very sharp. It was not the loose scroll of a man in a hurry. It was the handwriting of someone who had decided that what he was writing deserved to be legible to someone besides himself. That choice, to write clearly for a future reader, told me something before I read a single word. October 4, 1952. Reached the upper cabin by Coburn Creek Trail. 11 hours on foot from the Ridgeline Road turnoff. Supplies for 8 weeks. Left the truck with Elmer Castle in Farwell. He will not ask questions. I read the last sentence twice. He will not ask questions. Not, he knows I will come back. Not, he is a good man. The man who wrote that had built his life around a very specific value, other people's silence. I turned the page. October 5th. Wind from the northwest. Strong. Temperature dropped 10 degrees between noon and dark. Roof on the lean-to sagged along the north ridge. 3 boards need replacing before real snow. Found them all where I left it. Still sharp. Creek runs clean. This is a good place to think. A good place to think, I said out loud in the dark room, just to hear how it sounded. It sounded exactly like it looked on the page. I stood reading for a while. Outside, and the light was leaving. The temperature was already falling. I could feel it around my ankles, that cold draft from the floor that means the outside air is winning. My breath became visible again while I stood still. Maybe 60 or 70 pages were filled. After that, there were many blank pages. He had not finished, or at some point he had decided to stop recording and simply live in that place without turning it into words. Both explanations felt equally true. I closed the notebook carefully and held it with both hands for a moment. The light through the oilcloth was almost gone. I had maybe 20 minutes of grey left before the hollow sank into full darkness, and I still did not have a steady fire, a lamp, or any clear understanding of whether the roof would survive the night. I placed the notebook on the cot beside the wool blanket and returned to work. The problem was the stovepipe. I had seen it from outside when I first approached the cabin. The tin collar around the pipe where it passed through the roof had pulled away on the upper side, lifted by frost heave or simply by years of expansion and contraction. Weather was getting into that gap. Not through the shingles. Not through the ridge. Through that single inch of open seam around the collar. Every rain, every thawing snow, probably since 1971, had been running down the inside of the pipe, spreading across the top of the stove, and rotting the floorboards directly under it. That was the soft place I had felt when I first crossed the threshold. That was the smell. Not general decay, but one specific wet column of rot from roof to floor. I had maybe 15 minutes of working light left. The collar was held by 3 screws in the tin, 2 of which had rusted down to almost nothing. The third barely turned under the flat screwdriver on the handle of my back knife. I worked it out carefully and put it in my pocket. The collar itself could be bent back flush with one hand while I sealed the gap. I needed something to seal it with. I looked around the room in the fading light. On the shelf above the stove was a coffee can. Inside was roofing tar, hardened around the edges of the can but still soft in the center. It had been left there on purpose. He knew about stove collars. He had meant to fix it, or he had fixed it before and kept the material close for the next time. I worked loose a fist-sized chunk with a stick from the wood box, climbed onto the roof more by feel than sight, pressed it into the gap, held the pipe collar down with my knee, and worked the tar in with my thumb. The seam was not pretty. But it was sealed. By the time I climbed back down, I could not see my own hand at arm's length. I built the fire almost entirely by touch. I had laid the kindling and birch bark before climbing onto the roof. Good habit. Something my grandfather's notebook had mentioned too, not as an instruction, but as an observation. Always lay your fire before you need it. I found the box of wooden matches on the shelf where I had left it. The first match caught the bark. The bark caught the kindling. In 3 minutes, I had a small fire burning, the Coleman kerosene lamp was lit, and the cabin went from black to amber. At last, I could see what I was living in. The walls were closer than I expected. The ceiling lower. In the lamplight, the place looked less like a ruin than something pressed down by time. All the unnecessary air had been squeezed out of it. Only what was needed remained. I sat on the edge of the cot and finished the last crackers that had been in my jacket pocket since morning. Outside, the wind rose. It strengthened all night and did not ease until deep into morning. I heard it finding every gap in the chinking, a thin whistle moving around the cabin as if searching for a way in. I slept in my jacket, under the wool blanket, with the fire low enough to last until morning but not so strong that it would pull cold air down the chimney. I had read that somewhere. Maybe in the notebook. Maybe in one of the old folks' fire books I had owned since I was 14. You manage a night fire the same way you manage everything alone, carefully and sparingly. When I woke, it was still grey outside. The temperature inside the cabin showed 28 degrees Fahrenheit on the small thermometer I had hung from a nail by the door. Outside, I did not want to know. But the roof had held. I stood in the middle of that single room and looked up at the patch place. No new stain. No new sign of drops on the boards below. The fresh tar had taken hold. The metal lay where it was supposed to. Whatever mixture of lack, cold, and friction was holding it all together, it was holding. I allowed myself 20 seconds to be glad about that. Then I began thinking about water. The creek was 40 yards down the slope, through the spruce and the bare alder. I melted snow when there was snow and rationed what I had brought. The 1-gallon jugs from the truck were nearly empty. I needed to bring water from the creek to the cabin in a way that did not require carrying it up an icy slope twice a day. My grandfather had done it somehow. Behind the cabin, under a tap, lay a length of old galvanized pipe. Mounted on the east wall was a rusted hand pump, not connected to anything visible. At some point, there had been a proper water line here. It had failed, frozen, or simply been abandoned. I went outside and traced the remaining pipe from the pump backward. It went into the ground about 8 feet from the foundation. I found where it came out again on the slope, bent and split about 15 feet from the creek bank. 23 feet of pipe. That was all I needed. I did not have 23 feet of galvanized pipe. I did not have money for galvanized pipe. What I had was a pile of canvas, a length of clear vinyl tubing I had brought for another job, and a very specific memory of a page in the notebook where my grandfather had written, in letters slightly larger than his usual hand, "Gravity will do the work if you do not interfere with it." I took the notebook from my backpack and found the page. It was dated October 14, 1951. My grandfather had been trying to solve the same problem, a hand pump bolted to the wall with a hopeless supply line. It had taken him 3 days of thinking and half a day of building to find the answer. The drawing was small but precise, a holding tank on the slope above the cabin fed by gravity from the creek, with the intake set just below the surface of a natural pool where the water was clear and slow. The pipe did not need pressure. It only needed to be sealed, and the outlet had to sit lower than the inlet, with enough drop to keep the water moving. I stood in the cold with the open notebook in my gloved hand and looked up the slope. The creek was about 40 feet higher than the cabin at that bend. 40 feet of drop over, say, 60 feet of horizontal distance. More than enough. My grandfather had known that too. He had known it, built it, and then at some point the line had broken, frozen, or surrendered to 30 years of frost heave. Nobody had bothered to fix it because by then there was probably nobody left to fix it. I had 31 feet of clear 3/4-inch vinyl tubing coiled in the corner of the cabin where I had stored it in October, thinking it might be useful for drainage around the foundation. I had a half-used roll of plumber's tape and 4 clamps from the toolbox under the cot. I did not have a holding tank. But I did have an old galvanized livestock water trough, about 30 gallons, with a drain fitting already welded into the lower end from some previous use. One seam had a crack I had patched with roofing tar in November. The patch had held. I spent most of that day going up and down the slope with a shovel and a hand level, reading grade the way my grandfather's notes had taught me. Drive a stake. Set the level. Measure the drop. 1 inch over 10 feet. Repeat. By the time the light went flat and grey behind the southwest ridge, I had a line marked from the pool to a point near the eastern wall, and I knew the drop was somewhere between 38 and 42 feet. Enough. I did not start the installation that evening. The temperature was already falling, and I knew better than to work wet connections as the freeze strengthened. I ate, closed the stove damper partway, and by lamplight read the rest of that page in the notebook. My grandfather's notes were careful. They recorded what had gone wrong the first time and what he had changed. His first mistake turned out to be mine too. I realized it as I read. He had laid the intake line too shallow, not deep enough to remain below the frost line where the water seeped before entering the main creek. In February, the pipe heaved up, split at a joint, and the whole system drained into the slope for 3 days before he noticed. The following summer, he rebuilt it. He buried the intake 18 inches deep, packed it with gravel, and covered it with a flat stone for protection. That was the version that worked until the pipe rusted through 40 years later. I lay with the notebook on my chest. The lamp threw soft shadows across the log wall, and I understood something about that man I had not understood before. He was not a man who got everything right the first time. He was a man who wrote down what went wrong, waited out a season, then tried again. There is a patience in that, and it is different from stubbornness. Stubbornness is doing the same thing with more force. Patience is allowing failure to teach you what must change. I woke before dawn. The thermometer outside the south window read 9 degrees Fahrenheit. I built up the fire, boiled water, and stood by the stove because I did not want to sit still. By the time the sun lifted over the ridge, it was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and I was already on the slope with a shovel, a handsaw, then a coil of black 3/4-inch polyethylene pipe I had bought at the co-op in Harlan back in October and never unpacked. I also took the notebook, opened to that page and tucked into the breast pocket of my jacket so I could pull it out without taking off my gloves. I began at the intake end. I dug down 20 inches, breaking through a mean frozen crust that came apart in chunks like old plaster. Beneath it, the ground was dense but workable. Red clay mixed with weathered shell, smelling faintly of iron where it broke fresh. I laid the pipe in the trench with a steady downhill grade, packed gravel around the intake end, and placed the flat stone my grandfather had described over it. I found the original stone. It still lay near the edge of the pool, almost buried under a layer of rotting leaves. It fit exactly where I placed it, and it did not feel like coincidence. It felt like continuation. The line ran 64 feet down the slope to the holding tank. I connected it with a brass barb fitting and a clamp I had saved from a blown radiator hose on the truck. I did not open the intake until the trench had been filled and tamped. My grandfather's note about that was underlined twice, with one small sentence in the margin. Fill fast. Water is patient. You must be patient too. I filled fast. I opened the intake on Wednesday morning, November 14th, with the temperature at 19 degrees Fahrenheit and a thin skin of ice across the surface of the pool. I shifted the flat stone just enough for the water to find the pipe. Then I went down to the holding tank and waited. 4 minutes passed. The water came without ceremony. A dark trickle appeared at the bottom of the tank, almost silent, spreading across the plywood base I had placed inside. I did not shout with joy. I did not celebrate. I watched it rise to the level of the overflow cut I had made, watched it confirm itself, and then stop. My grandfather described that moment in one sentence near the end of his notes. When it finds its level, you will know you did it right. I knew. That day, I split a quarter cord of red oak that had been drying under canvas since September. Axe work warmed my back and shoulders in a way nothing else could. By the time I carried the last armload inside, the cabin was holding 57 degrees Fahrenheit without forcing the stove hard. That evening, I ate salt pork and dried beans by the light of the Coleman lamp and listened to the water moving through the pipe outside, a faint steady sound I could hear through the log wall whenever the wind eased. I was 19 years old. I had a roof that did not leak. A smokehouse with 40 pounds of venison hanging in it. A woodpile 6 feet high along the south wall. A water line running from a spring 2 or 3 bends up the ridge. And a notebook full of handwriting that was not mine, yet somehow was beginning to feel like mine. The mountain gave none of that easily. It charged for every yard of progress, a cut hand, a February that stretched longer than reason, a morning when I sat on the porch steps and could not think of a single convincing reason to continue. But the old man who had lived there before me had paid the same price and left the receipts. Each time I found one of them, a note in the margin, a pipe fitting that suited exactly the repair I needed, a stone already placed where it was meant to be, I understood what it was. It was companionship. It was instruction. It was one man deciding that whoever came next deserved a shorter version of his difficult road. That is what the mountain taught me. And that is what I will leave behind when I go. If something in this story spoke to you, if you know what it means to repair something with your own hands or to hear the voice of an older person in the work they left behind, write it in the comments. I would like to know your version.